Hello, freak bitches.
But to go back to the brainworm idea, so I coined the term not to be cute, but to actually name this collective condition. I call it ostrich parasitic syndrome.
Yeah, we've talked about this before.
Did we talk about
do
it?
you know that that's a myth?
Oh yeah, that
ostrich,
yeah. It's become just a metaphor for,
Right.
for yeah, absolutely.
The myth being, folks, that ostriches don't really stick their head in the ground.
Exactly, and it's really taken on a life of its own at this point. I'm actually thinking of studying this scientifically, not just as something that I talk about in my public engagement. What is it that causes some people to be more likely to be parasitized by the types of mindsets that would cause you to suffer from ostrich parasitic syndrome? So a classic example would be, which I guess we'll get into, how much evidence do you need to see around the world that there might be some religious ideology that is somewhat problematic and antithetical to secular, liberal, modern values? How much information, or what is the type of information that you would need to see before you're able to arrive to such a conclusion? And so one of the things I'm thinking of doing is to formally quantify a score of OPS, how much somebody suffers from OPS as a type of mindset, and what are some predictors that could help us understand who is more or less likely to be afflicted by this mindset.
Well, there's certain people that just never want to hurt anyone's feelings,
Right.
except when they think that it is within their rights to attack that person because that person is somehow or another victimizing someone else,
Right.
and then they'll be far more egregious than the original offense. Did you know about that guy that in Canada that's getting sued? Well, the Human Rights Council fined him $12,000 because he walked into
Yes, I
an
did,
apartment
yes.
that he owned with shoes on.
Yes, yes.
Because there was a Muslim family living there. Their lease was up, and he was looking to rent the apartment. They stopped responding to his texts, and so he opened up the apartment to show this apartment that he owns. And because he walked into a building that he owns with his shoes on, he has to pay them $12,000 for failing to accommodate their religious practices while showing their apartment to prospective tenants. That's crazy.
Welcome to Canada. We just had a thing called Motion M103. Are you familiar with this?
Look at this statement, though. I'm sorry to interrupt you,
Sure.
but the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario also found that he harassed them and created a poisoned housing environment
That's right. There you go.
because he refused to remove his shoes.
Some sensibilities are more equal than others.
But that is just... Why is it that people are so... especially and particularly with Muslims, like you'll notice that there's a lot of people that are... they will accuse everyone of Islamophobia, yet they'll shit on Christians.
Yeah.
It's really common. Like they don't, it's not that they believe in religious freedom. It's that they have like a pet cause. And the pet cause is almost like being a contrarian to a lot of like far right people who are really terrified of Muslims. Like they're trying to like figure out how to balance that out with their own ridiculous left-wing version of it.
Well, I think there are two elements to it. One is that they're just afraid to criticize Muslims because there are greater repercussions to do so than to criticize Seventh-day Adventists. So just from a very basic sort of survival instinct. But I think secondly, which is kind of part of the ostrich parasitic syndrome I'm speaking of, there are all sort of erroneous ideas that people have been infected with. The Muslim religion is a religion for the downtrodden, the brown people, the exotic others. And so to criticize them when they are a hapless exotic minority is simply racist and sexist. And people believe that, even though most of the countries that these people are coming from when they come to the West, not only are they the majority, they're almost the exclusive majority, right? So they are out of, I think, 56 countries that constitute the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, something like 29 or 30 countries. They're exclusively Islamic. There are no longer any religious minorities. It's in the order of 99.9 something. So to argue that people who come from these countries are, religious minorities. Well, I mean, they're religious minorities when they come to the West, but they're all coming from countries where, never mind that they're the majority, they've never interacted with someone who did not share their faith.
I don't think people understand that if that happens here, like you can't turn back from that without violence.
Right.
Like if I mean, I'm not saying that it would happen in the United States, but the fact that it can happen anywhere means it can happen everywhere. I mean, it really can. I mean, it's a big reach on my part to say that because there's no evidence whatsoever that it's going to happen here. But if you really look at some of the countries that are suffering under these really oppressive religious ideologies, where women aren't allowed to drive, where they have to wear covering all over their body that signifies that they're a part of this religious sect, like if someone tried to do that today, like if you had some blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy that made all women wear a certain outfit and they weren't allowed to drive and they weren't allowed to have the same rights, how many people would be standing up for them?
That's incredible.
Especially if it was a new thing. Like, there's something about old things, like old ideologies.
That gives them legitimacy.
It's so strange.
Yeah.
What is that?
Well, it's exactly what you said. You take an idea that someone holds. If he doesn't cloak it under the robe of religion, you commit him to a psychiatric institution. If he says, no, but this belief is part of my religion, suddenly you get a free pass. It's grotesque. But to speak to your point about, that you were stretching about it happening in the United States, you're not stretching it at all. As a matter of fact, I've argued, for example, when Trump won, that if you look at a long-term view of the issue of Islamic immigration, if what you focus on is, do we have the proper vetting processes to stop ISIS terrorists from coming in? That's a very short-term view of the problem. But if you recognize that societies will take often very, very long time before they become Islamized, it's not as though every single country that today is Islamic became instantaneously overnight Islamic. In some cases, it was a very, very quick invasion. In other cases, it took 500 years before the demographic realities shifted. And so, yes, if you look at it from the perspective of 10, 20, 50, 100 years, the U.S. stands no threat. But take a long-term view. I love this quote from, I think it was the Taliban who said it, that the United States have all the clocks and watches. We have all the time in the world. In other words, inshallah, eventually, God willing, we will conquer you. So this is the right way to look at this issue. Do you wish to have a society become more Islamized or less? Let me draw another analogy. At the end of every day, you can weigh yourself, and one of three things is going to happen. You've either lost weight that day, your weight did not change a single ounce, or you've put on weight. So let's analogize this with Islam. When Islam comes into a place, either the society gets better, nothing changes, or it gets worse. Do we have enough data at this point after 1400 years to suggest that we can try to bet what will happen to a society? The answer, regrettably, is yes. Again, I hate to have to preface, of course, most Muslims are lovely and peaceful and wish to simply raise their children. But Islam as an ideology, when it comes into a new society, is it a good thing? If yes, let's all turn Islamic. If no, then maybe we should have an honest conversation about this.
An honest conversation is what's really important, because these things get so emotionally charged, like the infamous Ben Affleck, Sam Harris debacle on Bill Maher's show. But that, to me, is a perfect example, because Sam speaks in such a measured tone, and he's so educated about it. He's not making these big, gigantic leaps, but people love to jump on him and call racism. He sent me some video that I just watched the other day where a bunch of people are just taking complete out of context statements, attributing him to him as being like, this is what he believes on things, when if you listen to the full extent of the conversation, he's literally saying like that I'm gonna say something here that could be taken out of context. Right. But what I'm saying is, like, imagine if someone was saying this.
Right.
How do you respond to that? And they use that as a statement. I mean, there's so much of that going on. There's so much.
It's so dishonest.
Well, there's this weird not me thing that they're doing.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not the racist. Right. He's the racist.
Right.
And they get you're racist. Right. Like the Ben Affleck thing. Like he was like, that is so gross. That is so racist. Like instead of just discussing this conversation, discussing this, especially on the Bill Maher show, because that shows, all those shows, is not to criticize that show, but all those shows we have a panel of 6 people. What you see is a bunch of people waiting to say something, and they have to jump in, and it's almost like they have to be salacious or they have to be outrageous just to get heard. You know, like everyone, those kind of shows promote this sort of disingenuous communication, because you can't be polite. Like you and I can be polite. It's just you and I. We can talk and we can have these long form conversations, but on that show, you don't have the time to unpack what's wrong with all ideologies, all things that tell you how to think. Forget about whether or not you think it came from Jesus or the prophet Muhammad or Joseph Smith. Anytime there's a doctrine that tells you how to think because of some mystical presence, some god or deity or prophet who has gotten the wisdom of the universe, and you must not question it, and women have to wear veils and dress up like beekeepers. And I mean, all that stuff is very, very problematic because people are prone, for whatever reason, I mean, I guess it's something that goes back to tribalism and alpha male chimpanzee behavior. We're prone to follow. We're prone to follow leaders. I mean, it makes it easier. And that's one of the things you're seeing here.
Well, what's amazing is that it's one thing to attack Sam because in the game of identity politics, he scores really poorly, right? He's a Southern Californian white male who doesn't speak any of the languages that matter, Arabic or so on.
And his parents had money. That's
his parents had money.
So I love that.
So your parents had money, you sinner.
Exactly. I only recently found out, maybe a year and a half ago when I met him last, that his mother is the creator of Golden Girls. Did you know that?
No, I didn't even know that.
Yeah. And I just looked at one of the Golden Girls that was rerunning, and you see, I think it's Susan Harris or something. But anyways, someone like me who comes from the Middle East, who escaped that reality, someone like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I've had many people on my show, I don't know how much you followed, but a lot of people who've all escaped from this world. Either they still consider themselves Muslim, but, not Muslim light, or ex-Muslims in many cases, they will be attacked. So imagine, so there is some woman who went to Wellesley College who doesn't know anything about Islam short of whatever she learned in her bullshit progressive course. She will lecture to us what true Islam is. Not the people who lived under it, not the people who ran away from it. She knows better because, so it's really grotesque, it's infuriating.
It's stunning. And it's also confusing. Because, like, when you see them do it, like, I mean, anytime someone goes so far overboard that objective reasoning is out the window, and you're so committed to whatever position that you're in that you can't look at both sides of it. Right. I mean, I could see why a lot of religious traditions would be comforting to people, remind them of where they came from, give them pride of their homeland, give them a personal good feeling that they're connected to some sort of an ancient tradition.
Right.
As long as it's not oppressing other human beings. Right. And there's got to be some, I mean, actually cultural patterns of behavior that people do, like celebrations, like Oktoberfest or something like that. Those things promote some sort of a pride, like I guess a pride in Germany and their beer making and all that stuff, without oppressing people,
But by the way, this is a good segue to what you're talking about. Is something that is upsetting me these days, increasingly so. So some people are now trying to draw a distinction between Islam and Islamism. The reason why I mention this is because Islam has two elements. There's the spiritual part, right? Which is, kind of like your Oktoberfest, pray this way, believe in a God, in a monotheistic God, and so on. But then within Islam is a much larger component of politics, political Islam. So when you say something like, well, we should be attacking Islamism, as if it's something that is outside of Islam, that's simply false. Islamism is Islam, right? Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, and I can quote many other Islamic experts, said Islam is Islam. The term moderate Islam, Islamism, and all these other qualifiers are nonsensical. Now, the reason why that upsets me is because it grants people a false sense of security and hope. Islam is wonderful, but we need to attack this separate thing called Islamism. Well, from day one, 1400 years ago, Islam was Islamism. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a spiritual element. That doesn't mean that most Muslims just want to practice the spiritual part. But there is no set of doctrines in a separate book called Radicalized Islamism. It all comes from the same text. It comes from the Quran, it comes from the Hadith, and it comes from the Sirah, the biography of Muhammad. So this kind of false narrative that people are promulgating so that they seem as though they're not frontally attacking a religion, while laudable, while nice, I get that reflex, it's false. And so again, to go back to our point of talking honestly, we need to talk honestly. There is only Islam. Some people choose to practice it fully. Some people choose to ignore the ugly part. But there is no such thing as Islamism. Islamism is part of Islam.
Now, you're a person that goes out of your way to say, no, we're not talking about the kind, sweet Islamic people that just want to raise their children. Now, so how do you sort of manage those two ideas, that they're the same? Like when the term radical Islam gets thrown around.
Right. So radical Islam simply means I really take my Islam seriously. Right? Let's draw a silly analogy. If I don't eat pork, am I radical Jew or am I a Jew? Right? Now, I happen to be Jewish. I simply ignore the kosher edict that says don't eat pork.
Why do you do that, though?
Because in my case, I simply identify as Jewish in the sense that Judaism is a multi-attribute identity. It includes a shared history, shared lineage,
It's kind of a race.
Some could argue it's a race. So
it's considered in a lot of people's ideas.
Right. So I could still, in the same way that you might identify as coming from Boston, and there's a shared history from all people who grew up around the time that you grew up in Boston, and there is a sense of affiliation and tribalism with that reality. Being Jewish, as far as I'm concerned, and for most Jews, is exactly that. We don't necessarily take the religious elements very seriously. Now, that doesn't mean that we are practicing a light Judaism or non-radical Judaism. We're simply ignoring those parts of Judaism that we choose to ignore. So there is no such thing as radical Islam. There are no books called radical Islam. There is a set of doctrines called Islam, and then I could do what's called cafeteria Islam, which is I pick and choose the parts that I wish to adhere to. So again, the discourse is a false narrative. I understand the reason for it, because people find it rather gauche to attack frontally a religion, or at least to attack Islam. So they have to, I call this the ism magic heuristic, right? You add ism to something, it makes it bad. Islam is good, Islamism is bad.
Now, I would like to defend you if there's a lot of people that are listening right now, or offer up some, not even defend you, but offer up some information. Like, yes, you grew up in a place where being Jewish was lethal. I mean, your life was threatened.
Certainly when the Civil War broke out. Prior to that, you could live in Lebanon as a Jew. People knew that we were Jewish, but know your place Jew. That, by the way, is something that I explain when discussing, I'm not sure if we've discussed this on the show, but it might be worth repeating.
I believe we discussed your past in Lebanon, how you,
Okay, so do you know what a dhimmi is? Have you heard that term, dhimmi?
Yeah, right. You explained it, but please do again. Just
So a dhimmi is a third-class citizen, comes out of Quranic edicts that basically said that when Islam comes into a society, you basically have three choices. If you're not a Muslim, you could either convert, you could either get killed, or if you are people of the book, meaning Christians and Jews, meaning people of the book, that you're also monotheistic, you're also from an Abrahamic faith, then you could live as a dhimmi. A dhimmi is a protected class, protected in quotes. We tolerate you, and in order to tolerate you, we're going to remind you repeatedly of your subservient position. Now, at different points across the last 1400 years, that mechanism was either instituted very forcefully or more lightly. So in the context of Lebanon, which was a very progressive and modern country in the Middle Eastern context, there wasn't somebody knocking on our door and levying the jizya, pay us or else we're going to rape your daughters. But you didn't wear a big Star of David, because that might be construed as inflammatory, just like the example that you started off the show. You're hurting our sensibilities by pushing your Judaism on us, right? So your status need not always have been threatened in that my head is going to come off at any minute, right? My parents grew up and lived there. They didn't die. But once the Civil War broke out, then it became lethally dangerous to be Jewish. I mean, we were going to be executed. We left. So you never know when we're going to go from tolerating you to off with the heads. And that's been the history for the past 1400 years. And so, again, when people think, but Islam is not that bad. Look, in Andalusia, Jews and Christians and Muslims used to walk around hand in hand in Spain around the 15th, 16th century. Baloney. Yes, people were not being beheaded every day, but you knew your place. And that's not equality.
And it's kind of interesting when you talk about this idea about how people are reluctant to criticize Islam because they're worried about the repercussions of this. It kind of speaks to how rare it is that people do violate those principles in those countries. Because if you do have a culture that's 99% Islamic, especially if they go by the book, like every step of the way, like there's not going to be a lot of people that are stepping out of line for fear of the horrific repercussions. Now, psychologically in this country, you're seeing that for some strange reason emerging from the left and emerging from a lot of like really progressive colleges and universities where they want to be almost the first ones to step up and say, don't criticize this one particular religion. Which is, it's very odd because it's the most regressive.
It's unbelievable.
It's a really strange position to be a progressive who's reinforcing the ideologies of a regressive culture that's very ancient.
But what's incredible is that they'll come up with ways to defend this cognitive inconsistency, and hence that's part of the ostrich parasitic syndrome that I was mentioning earlier.
What are some ways that they defend it?
So, example, let me just give you a few manifestations of ostrich logic. My friend Muhammad is a very nice guy, and he drinks and he fornicates and he's very liberal. So the idea then becomes that as long as I can identify a single exemplar of a Islamic person who does not otherwise adhere to what Islam dictates, then it's not true that Islam is bad. Now this is a manifestation of a more general cognitive bias, which goes like this. If I walk into class and I say, look, Homo sapiens are sexually dimorphic. There are innate sex differences between the two sexes. Men are bigger than women. Someone will put up their hand and say, but my Aunt Linda is taller than my Uncle Joe. Oh, gee, Darwin is dead, right? So they identify a singular exemplar that is supposed to falsify a statement that is only true at the population level. So that's one example.
Right.
Muhammad is nice, therefore Islam is nice. Here's a second example. They point to a particular historical context where Jews lived in Islamic countries and weren't killed. Hey, but Gad Saad, you lived in Lebanon and you still have your head. And the retort that I usually give is, well, until they were going to cut off my head. But secondly, Jeffrey Dahmer, if you take, I think he was guilty of 17 murders. If you take the number of days that he lived as an adult until he was caught, as a percentage of the days that he killed somebody, 99 point whatever percent of the days, Jeffrey Dahmer is a lovely guy. So it's unfair for you to say that Jeffrey Dahmer is a mean guy, given that 99% of the time he's nice. So what you have to basically do is take each of these ostrich logic arguments and analogize how idiotic they are. But it's very exhausting because the bent, as you said, of all these progressives is to do whatever they can to protect the ideology. And so it becomes exhausting to consistently have to try to fight through all their clutter.
And it's not a thought that it's not something that is structured with objective reasoning. It's something that's structured with their own particular ideology that does not want to criticize this one segment of the human population that they think is being persecuted.
Right. And meanwhile, if you think about throughout currently in the world, which ideology persecutes the most number of other people? So if you talk about bloody borders, right? Islam has fought with Buddhists. Islam fights with animists. Islam fights with Jews. Islam fights with Christians. Islam fights with Tibetan monks, right? So in other words, Islam doesn't necessarily make for very good neighbors. Why? Because, again, notwithstanding the fact that most Muslims are lovely and just want to raise their kids, Islam is a supremacist ideology. It basically says that the world is meant to all be united under the flag of Allah. Now, some people take that seriously, others don't. But the doctrines of Islam are very clear. We should all submit to Islam. So even if 95% of Muslims don't adhere to that tenet, if only 5% do, that means we're always going to have friction. In some cases, it'll be like Lebanon. By the way, I've predicted that in Europe, this is on record, we can probably find it, that in Europe within 15, 20, 25, 50 years, we're going to have Lebanon all over the place. And now it's starting to happen, right? At one point, we were having daily attacks all over Europe. So again, if you're going to increase Islamic immigration to the West, of course, most people are nice and just want to escape to a better world. But are you willing to take the risks for what's about to happen? Are you willing to accept people whose cultural and religious values are perfectly antithetical to yours? So, example, if you do Pew surveys from around the Middle East or Islamic countries about your views on Jews, well, you'll get things like 95 to 99% Jew hatred. So if I am a Canadian Jew, right, and I see that 50,000 Syrians are going to come in, is it that I'm filled with hatred towards Syrians, or am I simply someone who calculates statistical regularities and basically says that out of 50,000 people, if 95% have endemic Jew hatred as part of their identity, do I have a right to be concerned about this? I'm not worried about Haitians. They're black people. I'm not racist. I'm not worried about the Vietnamese, right? I'm worried about the cultural and religious baggage that you bring in. What about your views towards clitorises or homosexuality or religious minorities or black dogs? Darwin forbid if you're a black dog. You're not
black dog?
Yeah, I mean, Muhammad hated dogs, but he particularly hated black dogs. So again,
so what do they do with black dogs?
Well, go online and you'll see some pretty ugly animal cruelty. They're not very tolerant towards dogs. If you touch a dog before you're heading to prayer, this is called najis. It's impure. By the way, the kuffar, the non-Muslims, are also najis. They're as impure as urine and blood and sperm and feces. So, should I feel bad that there is an ideology that considers me an impure quality? Now, does that mean that all Muslims are like that? Of course not. 99% of the Muslims I've met have been lovely, and many of them are my friends. But we should be able to talk about what's inside those books. And those books are not radical Islam. They're Islam.
Well, let me ask you this. What's the alternative? Like, say, for Syrian refugees? I mean, any kind, caring person who has concern for our fellow human beings, sees these people fleeing and sees the horrific conditions that they're confronted with in their own country, and they really don't have a lot of options, and they're trying to escape to the West. What are the options? What do you do?
There are no clear answers. I would certainly say you first place the people who are most at risk in those societies in the front of the queue. So you bring the Yazidi women. You bring the Christians who are being persecuted.
The women, but what about the father? If the dad is with the wife and the children, you can't just have the father stay back behind in a tent and you let the mom go to Toronto with the kids.
No, fair enough. But what I was saying, though, is that let people who are non-Islamic, who are fleeing those areas at the front of the queue first.
But isn't that religious persecution? I mean, or at the very least, it's prejudiced, right? I mean, you're singling people out because of their ideology or because of what religion they're from, not because of their past behavior or any predictors whatsoever about their future behavior.
But we do have some statistical regularity about what types of values those guys are going to come with. So I'm not suggesting we close the door.
Right, but wouldn't that, in a way, I mean, just to play devil's advocate,
sure.
Wouldn't that, in a way, kind of put the Muslims in Toronto who do immigrate, pick that city, who try to immigrate to Canada, in the same sort of a position that your family was in Lebanon, where you were hiding the fact that you were Jews?
No one has an inalienable right to immigrate anywhere, correct? So if you wish to immigrate to the West, then leave every single syllable that constitutes a belief, attitude, position, value that is contrary to ours at the door, and then welcome in my brother.
But man, isn't that a crazy thing to say to someone whose entire life and their ideology is a big part of their identity and who they are, like how they view the world? So that's the structure for which they interface with other human beings.
But if those values, so let's suppose
I agree with you in a way. I agree with you overall when I talk about the entire human population, that it would be wonderful if we did that. But from individual to individual, we know about the trials and tribulations that people go through in a day-to-day life, and religious freedom and a religious ideology in many cases helps people get through the pains of life. It helps them get through the struggles. I'm not saying that it's rational, but I am saying that in many ways it's a scaffolding for their own personal behavior.
Got it. You would have to then ensure that your religious practice is exclusively practiced privately. Never should there ever be an intrusion into the public sphere. No asking for prayer rooms at the university. The example that you gave is the slight creeping jihad, right? It's the slow, so my next book is called, tentatively, it might change, Death of the West by 1,000 Cuts, right? It's the idea that when you take, again, a parable of the frog, when you put it in boiling water and you do it very slowly, the frog, if you do it very, very slowly, if it falls below a just noticeable difference, it doesn't notice that the temperature is rising until it's too late and it boils to death, right? So this idea of just noticeable difference is something that's very important in this conversation. We're not going to get Islamized overnight, but Egypt, before it became Islamic, used to be non-Islamic once upon a time. Today, it's about 10% Coptic Christians. Turkey is now 99% Islamic. One day it wasn't. Iran, the great Persian empires, were non-Islamic. Today, it's almost exclusively Islamic. So the United States and Canada are not going to become Islamic, in the next 10 years. But give it enough time, have a long enough view of history, and I worry about your grandchildren and mine. And so that's how you have an honest conversation. And I'm not sure what the answer is. One possibility, which I've discussed with folks on my show who are trained lawyers, is that there are provisions in the law, at least in the United States, to declare an ideology as being seditious, right? So in the same way that you could say that Nazism is seditious to our values, or communism, there are elements of Islam, the non-spiritual parts, that it doesn't take Einstein to recognize that they are perfectly antithetical to every single value that you and I would hold dear as Westerners. So,
like what?
What would be some of those values?
Yes.
So take, for example, Sharia law, right, which is the Islamic law by which you organize society. The first premise of Islamic law is that the crime, its severity, and its punishment depends on the identity of the perpetrator and the victim. So imagine the idea in the American Constitution that justice is blind. Well, that is already violated as the most fundamental tenet of Sharia law. If a Muslim kills a Jew, it's very, very different crime than if a Jew kills a Muslim. You can just go look up Reliance of the Traveler, which is the English translation of Sharia law, and you'll see all these things. So why should we tolerate this kind of stuff, right? Come in, my Muslim brothers, but keep the stuff that you yourself escaped from out of our country. We don't want it. And if you keep it out, come in and let's grow together and hug it out. But why should I be tolerant towards the intolerable?
I agree with you in theory, but I think the problem is, as soon as you tell someone to not follow certain aspects of their ideology, those aspects become even more attractive. And especially if they consider the West to be decadent and filled with sin and fornicating and drinking and all the things that they think are disgusting. And then these people are the ones who are telling you that you can't follow the word of God as brought down by the prophet from up on high. It becomes even more attractive to them.
So what do we do? What's
drugs, psychedelic drugs. Everyone gets on mushrooms, and I'm not kidding. Right. I really think you need transcendent experiences to escape from the day-to-day vibration of normal life.
How about just a commitment to reason and science?
It would be wonderful if we could do that, but people are so terrified of death, and they're so terrified of the unknown, and they're so terrified of not having structure. People love having ideological structure that they can govern their life by.